Okay, so we're now moving to the final part of the morning, which is going to be a plenary session. But before I introduce the women who will be speaking to us, I just want to take a moment to recognize some of the electeds that are with us. As you know, at the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, we prize and we nurture women public leaders, and women electeds are our heroines. So I just want to recognize, if they're here, would they stand? New Hampshire Representative Mary Stewart Guile. Connecticut State Senator Beth Bye. Our very own Massachusetts State Senator Patricia Jalen. Again, from Massachusetts, Karen Spilka. I'm not sure she's here yet, but she will be speaking this afternoon. Gail Golden, Rhode Island State Senator. And last but certainly not least, Representative Keiko Oral, who is, I'm very proud to say, a member of the Center's board, advisory board. We really appreciate your being here, Representative Oral. Okay. So it's now my very great pleasure to introduce a phenomenal group of women and a very important initiative, and it's called Prosperity Together. And I want to say that we're not only trying to build linkages between states in New England and create a powerful regional agenda, a powerful regional force. We are trying to create partnerships with national organizations with whom we share a mission and share a passion for justice. And Prosperity Together is such a national initiative. It's a nonpartisan coalition of public women's foundations dedicated to improving the economic security of low-income women and their families in America. Our missions could not be more closely aligned. So I'd like to invite up to the stage the women who will be speaking. The title of this plenary is, as you can see, From Economic Disparities to Economic Security, Lessons from the Prosperity Together Initiative. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Lockwood-Shabat, the President and CEO of the Washington Area Women's Foundation, Elizabeth Barajas-Roman, Executive Director of the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts, Ruby Bright, Executive Director and CAO of the Women's Foundation for Greater Memphis, welcome from Tennessee, and Dawn Oliver Wiand, Executive Director of the Iowa Women's Foundation. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Anne, for that introduction. And I have to say, probably like a lot of people, had a little bit of anxiety about this panel and coming here today, but this morning has been such a breath of fresh air. And for me in particular, I am from New Hampshire, so this is home for me. I'm an alum of University of New Hampshire. And so thank you, Evelyn, for reminding us about the tough old New England spirit, which I sometimes forget, being in DC for 20 years now. It's a little bit of a bubble, and it's pretty dark right now, and this has been so incredibly powerful and uplifting. So I'm honored to be here with all of you today, and I'm honored to be here with all of my colleagues and sister friends to talk a little bit more about some really incredibly exciting work that we are doing both individually in our states and our regions, but also collectively together as women's foundations. You know, I loved what Dr. Berry said when she talked about, you know, staying in your lane and doing the work that you need to do. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, because the reality is that the work that we've been doing for the last 20, 30 years is the work that we were doing on November 7th, it's the work we're doing on November 9th, and it is the work that will carry us forward. And so nothing about that has changed. It'll be harder and we'll dig deeper, but the work is still there and has to be done. And so we want to share some, I think, incredibly inspiring examples of things that are happening in each of our communities. So before we get into a panel conversation and Elizabeth, Ruby, and Dawn have an opportunity to share a little bit about what they're doing, I just want to talk briefly about what is Prosperity Together and how we all came together. As Anne said, it is a collective effort of 29 women's foundations from across the country representing 23 states and DC, which I'm just going to say 24 states. And we came together, and I think what's really interesting, and Ruby, I hope you don't mind that I sort of share this. When we first came together, how many other women's funds or women's foundations are in the room? You have a few other, Veronica.
Yep.
I think if you are familiar with women's foundations or women's funds and the work that we do, I would say we're probably the best kept secret in terms of how you really get things done in a community, in partnership with women at the table driving and leading that. And several of us who have been doing this work together for a long time came together and said, you know, what can we do to make a statement? How do we raise the visibility of the work that women's foundations are doing around women's economic security specifically? And we started talking loosely and said, oh, you know, could we make a funding announcement? Could we pool our resources? You know, what could that be? And we kind of threw out this number of, well, maybe we can invest $100 million. And then we went into this, what I'm going to say is what women typically do, and we hemmed and we hawed, and we said, oh, I don't know, will it get to 100 million? How do we track it? How do we prove that we're doing it? And we spent a lot of time, a lot of anxiety over it. And finally just sort of set it aside and said, you know what, no offense to the men in the room, but if it were a group of men sitting around a table, it would be $1 billion. And it wouldn't matter how you're going to track it, you're just going to do it. Yeah. And so we all came together and said, you know, we can collectively invest $100 million over the next 5 years in improving the economic security of low-income women and women and girls of color specifically. And so that was our goal. And we came together and collectively decided we could do it. Yeah. We made that announcement in DC in partnership with the White House Council on Women and Girls a year ago, last November. And that moment and that opportunity to partner with the administration and make that announcement really allowed us a platform and an ability to raise the visibility of the work that we're doing, the strategies that we're employing, in a way that I don't think we could have done before. It doesn't mean that that platform has now gone away. We're there. I'm going to share a little bit about your results, because I think one of the things that's incredibly powerful is we had a goal of how much money we thought we were going to put into the community the first year. We just did that analysis, and we invested over $29 million in the first year, which is 46% more than we thought we could do. So the work is getting done, and it will continue to get done. In addition to the $29 million, we touched nearly 1,000 nonprofits across the country. More than 4 million women were reached as a result of our grant investments, and we engage in a range of economic opportunity strategies and really learned from one another about best practices in our communities. So that's just a little bit of a backdrop and framing around what Prosperity Together is and what our recent accomplishment is. We're very proud of that. Now I want to turn to my colleagues and just take a few minutes to share a little bit about each of your foundations, and then also to share your unique perspective around why becoming a part of Prosperity Together and this collective effort was important to you. So Elizabeth, we'll start with you from Western Massachusetts.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so starting off on why this work is important to me. So I'm a first-generation Mexican-American who grew up in the Midwest. And most of my family then and most of my family now rely on working-class jobs. Everything from the railroad to meatpacking plants to manufacturing. Again, most of my family rely on those jobs. Thinking back on the Reagan years, there was a time when everyone I knew, every single person I knew, had at least one or both parents that were laid off because of that connection between those working class jobs and just how connected that was. So why that's important is that it's been disturbing over the past week to hear policymakers talk about the working class or talk about blue-collar jobs, but really talking about white men working those jobs. Because we know that there's a big demographic there. We also, what's really disturbing about that is not just that it's code for that, but it's allowed them permission to say that social issues can be subjugated and or ignored because we're going to focus on economic issues. And what's really exciting about Prosperity Together is that it's 29 different organizations across the country that have said, we're going to hold the line, and we're not going to let policymakers make that leap to say that racism, sexism, homophobia, religious oppression don't matter when you're talking about whether or not a family can prosper economically or whether or not a family is going to face economic despair. So again, that's something that's very, very important to us. And the Women's Fund of Western Mass, we operate a program called the LIPI program. It's the Leadership Institute for Political and Public Impact. I think we have some graduates and folks here in the room today. Excellent. And the purpose of this, it's not a new program. It's a program that's been around for about 7 years. But what's new in relation to Prosperity Together is we're moving from this idea of individual kind of training and leadership and moving into this idea of collective power and collective leadership. And that's been very important even over in the past year when Massachusetts was looking at passing the pay equity bill. Our graduates were at the front line working for grassroots mobilization, coming to Beacon Hill. Again, that training, going from individual skills that they learn and being able to pull that into collective power. We're seeing that now. Our graduates are working on a historic bill that will protect pregnant workers' rights here in Massachusetts. And again, they're at the front lines, they're leading that. So again, very, very important. The other pieces that we're training are encouraging these graduates to think about public service and saying, looking at beyond just the public policy advocacy, but saying you too can lead and be a public official. The pipeline, we're saying forget the pipeline, forget the leaky pipeline, forget the broken pipeline, because a pipeline means that you're at the back of the line. It means that women are at the back of the line. It means that people of color are at the back of the line. We're saying we're building our own networks. We're building our own power. And we're saying that when we look around the room, we're going to call someone in this room Madam President in our lifetime. So.
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth. We could maybe just end there. But
I know.
I know. Ruby, how are you going to follow that?
Well,
Can you share a little bit about Women's Foundation for Greater Memphis?
thank you. I know that you all are probably thinking, okay, DC, Mass, Iowa, and then Memphis. How does that work, right? And women's leadership and women's organization. Well, I'll tell you how it works. It's a way, when I started with the foundation, in this foundation work, which is, women's work, my past work has been in youth development, certainly in nonprofit. I've been in nonprofit for 30 years. But I worked for an organization called Junior Achievement. So that was teaching about the free enterprise. And that's when I recognized how important it was that the children in city schools in Memphis, which was 90% African American students at the time, did not know basics about how they could, think about their future to become entrepreneurial. And to watch the light bulbs go off in their minds, and when there was freedom for discovery, freedom for thinking that you can. So when I came into this women's work 16 years ago, I was very naive and also had lived in a bubble around the fact that none of this can work for these young people unless there's change at a higher level and opportunities that would come before them. So the mission of our work in Memphis is to promote philanthropy, foster leadership, and support programs that help women and children reach their full potential. And through that, we have a high focus on providing support for organizations. We're a grant-making organization, providing support for organizations that are primarily focused on low-income, no-income families, helping them to become self-sufficient. And what we've recognized over these years, and what we're recognizing now, probably more important, the first thing that has to occur is that self-empowerment has to be in place. We ask the question, why don't she send her children to school every day? That's important, right? Why don't you? Then it's, why don't they have the basic needs of pencil and paper? Why is their uniforms, why are they dirty? Well, because of the work that the Women's Foundation is doing in Memphis and doing it really on the ground, we don't write the check and say, here, grantee partner, do your work. We walk with the grantee partner, we walk with the people that they are serving. And we see that we're in this together. We learn from those experiences, and we are able to come back to the table. And I will say that with the Women's Foundation for a Greater Memphis, we had to find our own path. We had to find out where the tables were and invite ourselves to those tables and have a strong voice. What is it when you put one woman in a room with a room of men? There's maybe an acknowledgement that she's there. You put two, they have to look to one side, to the other side, right? 3 women in the room, okay, now we got conversation, and maybe can be heard. And so we employed that practice in Memphis, took on a strong partnership with the city of Memphis to help with bringing Hope 6 funding to the community for revitalization. I say that so that I can go back to say that we are on the ground working with families. We're able to help people understand why and have the answer to those questions. And we turn the why into how can we help. And stability of a roof over our heads. Safety for my family. Food on the table. If those basics are there, then I can start to make sure that my child is going to school if I can get a job. Not that she has to babysit 4 days a week so that I can do a part-time job that brings minimum wages and I have to hide those wages because I cannot lose my subsidies. How do we help create some playing fields that does not have to be a suppression and an obstacle for building and growing economic security? So that's what's important to us. How do you remove a barrier around policy? Policy, I would say it's only been 3 years ago that we could say advocacy, at our board meetings and, be ready to strengthen that. So policy now is something that we're looking at because policy has been a barrier. Simply as getting a job for $8 an hour. My rent was $60 yesterday. By Friday, I make $250. Now my rent is $600. How is that empowering? How do you, because I'm on subsidy, all of my subsidies are starting to go away. So we work with the city of Memphis, the state of Tennessee, to find out how could we change that. And through some practices and promising practices that we put in place, we were able to repeal that so that women gaining gainful employment would have a sliding scale rent trajectory based on their income. And that's kind of a grassroots experience that we've had in Memphis. And since that time, we've elevated to other areas that connect to regional, my colleagues in Knoxville, Nashville, and Chattanooga on other issues. But that's what Memphis is doing. And we're learning through our work with Prosperity Together how important that is. The leadership and the network with Prosperity Together elevates the opportunity to think bigger, leverage resources, build partnerships and collaborations that can create systemic change. And that is what's important to me in Memphis and to our board of directors, and that's why we feel that it's important to be a part of this movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. So Ruby, I feel like you touched on so many things that are very unique pieces of work from women's foundations, and I want to come back to that in just a second, especially, and Elizabeth, you did as well, in terms of really putting women front and center, and it is, we are not doing to or for, but really empowering. So we'll come back to in a second. Dawn, can you talk a little bit about Iowa Women's Foundation and some of the work that you're doing and why Prosperity Together has been important to you?
So first of all, thank you. I'm excited to be here to share with you today our work and what we are doing in Iowa. I do represent a state fund, and so we do work with the entire state. I like to share with people, because they don't really recognize this, 70% of Iowa's female head of households are struggling. 40% are living below the federal poverty line, and additional 30% are those working poor. The women who are above the federal poverty line, but they're not making enough money to support themselves and their families without some kind of assistance. To the Iowa Women's Foundation, that is unacceptable. And that's really why we do the work that we do. And we do our work a little differently than a number of other regular organizations. We don't have a shelter that we operate or a teenage pregnancy prevention program. We actually do our work through 5 key strategies. And those strategies include research, grant making, advocacy, education, and collaboration. We use research to find out what are the greatest barriers to women's economic security. We then target our grant making to make sure we're helping programs that are creating pathways to success. We then foster advocacy, promote awareness, and ultimately know we have to do it through collaborations, because if we really want to see the change for Iowa's women and girls that we want, we have to do that through collaboration. Our research that we started back in 2011 is She Matters, and that research was done by a collaborative effort of 14 women's organizations from across the state that came together to look at research through a gender lens and to compile gender-specific data. That's when we learned that 70% of our female head of households were struggling. We wanted to know why, and we wanted to know if those reasons were the same across the state or if they were different in different communities in each of the states. So in 2015, we identified 18 communities across the state. They were from rural to urban, from small to large, and we traveled to those states. And we had a goal, 3 goals. We wanted to learn what were the barriers that were keeping women from being economically successful, what initiatives were in place that were helping, what gaps existed, and then quite honestly, we asked these communities, how do they need our help, and how would they like the Women's Foundation's help? We took that data back, and we identified 6 barriers to economic success in the state of Iowa. Those barriers include employment, child care, housing, transportation. I always forget them. I got the report. If you want to know the rest of them, you can ask me. Amongst those 6 barriers, we identified 4 commonalities or themes that came up. That was education and awareness, empowerment, flexibility, and generational poverty. So once we learned that, we decided to go back out to the cities and the communities this last summer. We presented the data, and we asked each one of those groups, now that you know what the issues are in your community, what do you want to do to work on that? How do you want to break down those barriers, and how can we help you? So now the Iowa Women's Foundation is working with communities across the state by targeting our grant making and helping them with those programs, including advocacy and education, and now we're looking at collaboration. And you asked why we joined Prosperity Together. Quite honestly, it was a no-brainer. It completely aligned with our work. It helped us elevate our work. It helped us amplify our work. It lent credibility to our work. And to be perfectly honest with you, we know that if we're helping women in Boston or Memphis or across the entire country, we're helping women in Iowa. And that's why we need to all work together for this.
Thank you, Dawn. You know, as I'm listening you talk about the issues facing women in Iowa, and I'm thinking you're talking about the issues facing women in DC where I work, or Western Massachusetts, or Memphis. Sorry, let me move this over here. As I'm listening to you talk about issues facing women in Iowa, I'm thinking it's very similar for us in DC. We're regional, so Northern Virginia and 2 counties in Maryland that we're operating in, and they're the same issues that are impacting low-income women and women and girls of color in Western Mass and Memphis. And so I think for me, one of the interesting learnings about partnering with women's foundations and Prosperity Together is that even though we're each in very different parts of the country, the reality of women's lives is not all that different when we're talking about the issues and the pieces that you've put forward in terms of what you want to focus on here. Each of you touched a little bit about research, grant making, and advocacy, which I think are themes that all 4 of us work on in our work. And Elizabeth, Massachusetts now has the strongest equal pay law in the country. Congratulations. That's incredibly exciting. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how that came about and the role of your fund and I think the role of Lippy and the women that you're working in training with.
Sure, absolutely. I think that the importance of collaboration can't be underscored enough. The coalition, I think we have Jill Ashton in the audience right there, led by Jill and she did an amazing job of making sure that it wasn't only a wide coalition, but it was deep as well, and had a variety of different people at the table, including business, which was a big piece of, I think, part of the success in raising, getting to where we are now. In terms of Lippy and the Women's Fund of Western Massachusetts, definitely, again, having trained women who were trained in advocacy, policy advocacy, trained not only in that, but also the confidence to be able to say, this is what we need to do, and this is what we're going to go do and help make happen. And the ability to lead their peers and their community, that grassroots kind of mobilization, was key in keeping the issue front and center. It was key also in Western Mass. It looks a little different than Boston, but it's in terms of the very different types of areas, both kind of faded cities, rural areas, more of a mix between kind of how people feel in terms of progressive issues. But again, that deep coalition, the ability to talk to people across the aisle from your community because you know them, I think was a really important piece in terms of elevating the issue. Again, having women on the ground, speaking from their heart, speaking from their experience, I think is unmatched when you're looking at moving a policy forward.
You're so right. There's nothing more, I think, more powerful than hearing from the people who live the experience every single day. I was speaking on a panel in DC yesterday about early care and education and some work we're trying to do in Montgomery County in Maryland. And it was a group of policymakers and lots of conversation about what it looks like and what the policies and the subsidy and this and that. And I finally said, it's a great coalition of people in the room, but where are the women that you're talking about? They're not here and they're not at the table. And so the policies are very well intentioned, but if you don't hear from a real lived experience about what it's like to take 3 buses and not have childcare, and then you don't understand how that trickles down and how it plays out in the experience. So I think it's critically important. We've talked a little bit about research, which Dawn highlighted, and Ruby, I know you have spent a long time, have a long history, track record in Memphis with the Memphis Hope work with public housing. And really taking those learnings and looking at the data and what's happening in Memphis and using that to really focus in on a place-based strategy within one zip code, right?
Right.
So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So in 2004, the city of Memphis had the opportunity to apply for a Hope 6 grant. You're all familiar with those. And there are various criteria for applying for these grants around the country, and you know that there's high competition. One of those criteria that the city was looking at is the fact that this particular Hope 6 grant would not provide any case management, any support services for the families that were involved. So the city of Memphis Housing Authority asked the Women's Foundation, we were fairly new, could we help identify the funders who could possibly take charge of that? Board chair and I got together and we looked at each other and said, we need to do this. We need to raise the $1.2 million that they're requesting. Of course, we'd never raised $1 million already, in our whole grant making, in our whole budget. But it was intriguing. We took that information to our board, held a board meeting 2 days later, and shared what this opportunity could mean for low-income women in terms of providing supportive services as a part of this, what it would mean for women in women's leadership. And the board unanimously voted to say, yes, we will raise that $1.2 million. Well, the greater community kind of thought we were crazy, to make that decision based on our track record in fundraising. 4 years later, we were moving forward and had raised those dollars and more. It created a public-private partnership, and as we looked at the data and the work and building on what we created actually Memphis Hope, and utilize a program called Urban Strategies to do so. A delivery service for case management. All said to just bring you up to date, in the last 2 years, imagine that being 13 years ago that we started, 5 community redevelopments later, 2,600 families in a case management load where we are able to see first-generation college students, good early education and early child care, more employment, and not only just employment, but good jobs, livable wage jobs occurring. We took those learnings and then said, how do we elevate this? Poverty reduction is so small or none when you look at the whole. And in one zip code in our city, zip code 38126, we have a Vision 2020 plan. And that Vision 2020 plan, overarching goal is to reduce poverty in the poorest zip code in our city, one of the 10 poorest zip codes in the country, to reduce poverty in that place-based area by 5%, 5 basis points by 2020. And we put our stake in the ground. We're moving forward to achieve that goal, looking at the research. And I'll tell you, when we did the research, 28%, Memphis was 28% poverty rate 2 years ago. Now it's 26. We reduced it a little bit. But in zip code 38126, 62% poverty rate. With children, 76% poverty rate. That's where you have to really go out and do something and make a difference. So we hope to achieve that goal with our learnings, with our experience, and with our investment into the community. It's a $10 million commitment over the next 4 years now, but we made a $10 million commitment to reduce poverty in that zip code so that we can model that and move it forward.
Wow, that's incredible. And Ruby, can you say a little bit more about the other partners that are at the table with you that you're leveraging in this work?
Absolutely. Not only on a local level, but we are working with Workforce Investment Network. We're working with the City of Memphis, as I said, Memphis Housing Authority, the school system, Shelby County School System, which is the largest school system in our city, representing 117,000 students. All of those students are on free lunch programs, so to just give you some context in terms of that. Those partnerships also help us to work with funders, partnerships with funders not only in our community, but economic development. And bringing this so we are in the process of eradicating the last public housing, concentrated public housing, if you will, the last concentrated public housing in Memphis. That redevelopment and transition of those families are in place now. And that could not happen without public-private partnership, without national funders as well as local funders. This project, $30 million coming into the community for redevelopment, $3 million specifically on the Job Plus program. The Women's Foundation played a key role in helping to be the backbone organization to bring those funds in. But what we are looking at is economic development that in that South City area, businesses have come on board, amassing about $262 million in economic development. How do you leverage that up? Through the medical district, through entertainment and tourism, to industry jobs. And our role will be holding these companies accountable for employment, employee-driven strategies, like, FedEx has made a commitment to work with us to not only help us and get people employed, but to help retain them and help to build a career. And sometimes you have to remove some barriers in that particular case. Records, there are things that have to be removed, and forgiven to create point of entry. So we're proud of those partnerships. We're proud to be the only women's foundation in the country to receive a philanthropy award from the Department of Labor because of our philanthropic work in our community. Did I hit the partnership?
Yes, thank you. That did answer my question. And the reason why I asked is because I think it's another interesting aspect of our work is the ability to bring together lots of different key stakeholders. I know for us in DC, we're regional, and there's always lots of conversation about how do we get out of our silos and how does DC think about Maryland and Virginia and vice versa, because it's a very transient population. I live in Fairfax County, Virginia. My office is in DC. I spoke on a panel in Montgomery County, Maryland. We're always crossing state lines every day. People live, work, and play. But yet we don't think about our policies and practices in our region from a regional perspective. And so we're just starting to work on some work that's specific to the early care and education workforce, because we know, one, it's a significant work support for working women, working parents. It's also about preparing our children to ensure that they're ready to succeed in kindergarten, but it's also the majority of early care education workers are women, and they are low income, low wage jobs. And so thinking about it from a workforce perspective, in our region, the credentials are not portable. So the credential you have in Maryland is not going to help you with the job in DC. And so we've been able to pull together a group of key stakeholders. So we have representatives from each of the governments, from higher education, advocates, providers, policymakers, all coming together at the same table to say, this is a serious issue, and we can no longer address it in each of our jurisdictions by ourselves. And we actually have an effort that's really moving forward to create a regional-wide plan. And I think it was our ability to convene those different stakeholders and bring them together that's actually moving the work ahead, because everybody has their day job, and it's hard to step outside of that. But I think it's one of the things that women's foundations are able to really bring folks together. Don, you are sort of the interesting one on the panel that it's Iowa statewide. It's not a small state. So you talked about the research that you're doing with She Matters and the statewide listening tour. Can you share a little bit more about the statewide listening tour and how that is actually translating into the work and the policy that you'll be doing?
And I think it also definitely shows where those partnerships are a major role and how the women's funds play in convening them. Because we knew that if we wanted to enter out into these communities, we couldn't just walk in and say, hi, here we are, let's talk. We had to really develop partners. And so we developed community partners in each of the communities. Then we asked them to help us identify who should be at the table, who are those leaders helping women and girls, who are running the nonprofits, who are the church leaders, who are the businesses, the schools. And we brought them all to the table and had the conversations. That's when I said we learned the barriers. We asked them to identify a barrier to work on. We asked them then to come up with a small plan that they could do to help work on that barrier. And it could be something that was already going on in the community, or it could be something that was missing that they needed to. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but this has become my new favorite document. This is the state of Iowa, and these are the communities that we went to, and these are the little icons represent the barrier that each of those communities has chosen to work on. And the interesting thing you can see is if you travel through the entire rural component of the state, it's childcare. Childcare is the #1 issue that 9 of the communities chose to work on. So now what we as a foundation are trying to say is, okay, we're a staff of 1.5. How are we in 18 communities? And how can we best work with all of these individuals and these companies and these things to move forward? And that's what we're looking at. But I'll give you a couple of examples of some of the things they're doing. In Sheraton, Iowa, there are 4 major corporations who have numerous entry-level positions available that they cannot fill. They do not have enough qualified candidates. Why? Is it because they're not skilled or trained? Is it because they don't have childcare? They don't have transportation? We don't know. We're going to convene those 4 companies, and the Women's Foundation is going to be the facilitator of that discussion, and we're going to find out what the issues are, and we're going to see how all of these partners can come together to work on that, to help the companies get those jobs filled and help the individuals fill the jobs. In the child care industry, what we're finding is that they're losing positions. There's a small community in Jefferson, Iowa, where they need over 800 spots. There's 200. That means there's 600 people women who are not able to go to work because they cannot find child care for their children. Why? What's happening, and how can these communities come together and address the child care issue and help it so these women can go back to work? So those are the kind of things that we're looking at in all the communities across the state.
Elizabeth, you're nodding your head. Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm just nodding in agreement with what everyone shared in terms of, again, the power of women's funds and women's foundations in your community. Most areas have a women's foundation or a women's fund relatively close by. Even in the Boston area, there's a few that are here. But just the ability to we talk about it sometimes as a neutral party. We know we're not neutral. We know we have an idea of how we want to move forward, but as a foundation, as a funder, to be able to bring different parties together, provide a platform for them to talk and to problem solve. But the other thing, again, really important, is that the value that women's funds have on constituent-led efforts, and making sure that as we're convening people, that the people at the table also include those who are most impacted by whatever decision comes out. So again, I think it's just a powerful story behind what women's foundations do.
Yeah. So speaking of those powerful stories, sorry, you're having a hard, I'm going to have to do this, I think. Speaking of the powerful stories, I talked just a second ago about what we were able to do in year 1, which was $29 million went out into the community, which is 46% more than we had initially anticipated. I wonder if each of you can share either a data point or a story that exemplifies the investment that you made in your community and what the resulting outcome was. You want to start?
Sure, I'll be happy to start. Our budget and our 2016 budget, which is the first year that we actually made grant making in our specific zip code with the focus of place-based work, using the 2-generation approach, working with families, working with the mother or the guardian and their children, providing opportunities for all, making sure that there's comprehensive case management support for everyone that's needed, employment, career training, as well as employment training and job placement is a priority. I think about 42% of our investment of about $1,100,000 in 2016. And then also, the youth development process there needs to be in place, early education and early child care, but also financial literacy. So I think the example of success for us is that I'll use this example. One of the programs that we funded was actually a high school basketball program for girls. And why is that important? Well, what we found out is that it's important because young girls who typically play basketball, and particularly at this school, this inner city school in this community, they're looking for scholarship opportunities. It's not about the game, it's about the opportunity that it can provide for them. Well, these young girls also they had aspiration but didn't have help in terms of how to direct them, how to get them ready to prepared for college, how to help them think about themselves, you know, all the way down to, and it's mostly women in this room, you know, just hygiene care, health care, just the basic things, being able for them to be able to say those, that these are the issues that we have in front of us, and that's beyond the bullying and all of those kind of things. But what we found is that they just needed their voices heard. And their frustration that they put on the court to be smart about that. Point being is that this group of girls participated, they went to several colleges. Their success is that all 15 of them moved to the next grade level with high marks. There were 5 seniors within the 15 girls. 100% of them received scholarships, 4-year scholarships, and their interests range from healthcare to STEM, engineering. Not, you know, I want to be a teacher, and nothing's wrong with that, but they really had aspirations, and we were able to see the growth, and then the second program went from 15 girls to 22 girls participating, and that's an immediate success.
It's a good thing she said. It's a good thing she said one.
Can you maybe move your microphone up a little bit? I think
Okay.
everyone's having a hard time hearing us.
It's a good thing she said one, because I could probably sit here for the next hour and tell you all kinds of amazing stories of things that we've been able to do across the state. But the one I want to share with you is one that we're doing in Des Moines. It's a child care program, hence child care. And it's a program for culturally sensitive child care. The immigrant population in Des Moines is growing by leaps and bounds. And there were numerous women who wanted to go to work, but there was not enough culturally sensitive child care for them. So we are supporting a program that is training women to become child care providers. So that group is now developing a career and providing a service. We have trained in 1 year 47 women to become child care providers from 14 different language groups, allowing 90 women to go to work. So that's the kind of stuff that we're pretty excited about.
Elizabeth, do you want to share a story?
Again, just thinking about kind of the amplification of the work that we've been able to do since really thinking about working locally but aligning ourselves regionally and also nationally. It's just been tremendous. We had originally started off kind of doing smaller grants, doing smaller grant making. We're a relatively small foundation. But once looking at this kind of Prosperity Together framework, understanding that the investment has to be big. The investment has to be big to be able to move big issues across our Western Mass region, but also to connect them across the state and also nationally. The foundation committed to tripling the amount of grants we do, both from not only small grants, but moving them to bigger grants per year, but also multi-year grants. We moved from doing about $80,000 in grant making to now nearly $500,000 in grant commitments over the past couple of years. So
That's great.
Yeah. And we're about to launch another round of grant making that's $250,000 of grant making commitments this winter. Again, that actually is really not a whole lot of money when we're talking about the type of change we'd like to see. But what we're really excited about and why we think, again, the framework of Prosperity Together is so powerful is that it's been a catalyst for other investors. It's been a catalyst to invite other foundations, to invite other types of multi-sector partnerships to say, we're willing to do this. join us, and we will be successful. We have a lot of skin in the game, and we know that women get things done. So, so again, I think that's been powerful, and we've already seen both private donors step up and other foundation connections step up to be able to match us on that. So I think that's a tremendous power behind that.
And I think it's also about encouraging one another to be bold,
Right.
which is what we, I think, do lots of times when we have conversations and you say, well, could you invest X amount? You say, well, I don't know, maybe I could, maybe I can't. And then it's scary in the moment, but the fact that you've made that commitment is incredible, and it's going to have huge
Figure it out.
returns. And the women in your community are absolutely going to benefit as a result of that. One of the things that is come up a little bit as each of you talked is the interconnectedness between local, state, and federal policy, because it is all connected, and we can certainly lament and be scared and uncertain about what will happen at the federal level, but as has been stated, there's lots of opportunities at the local and state levels. And it's an interesting moment in time for us in DC because we're both local, but we're also national at the same time. And so I have the opportunity to really plug into a lot of the networks that are happening, locally in our communities, but also connecting with national organizations in the women's community and sort of some of their thoughts about how to move forward. And I think for us, what's really interesting is that we've been able to be a voice for other women's foundations, because many of the national organizations, what they're looking for is the stories, the on-the-ground stories of what's really happening, and they want to hear from women, and they don't necessarily have a partner or a connectivity or a grassroots organization to be able to lift up and share those stories. And I think that's something that we've been able to do on behalf of all women's foundations, but also connecting each of the partners of prosperity together to do the same. So when somebody says we need to hear from somebody about childcare or transportation or a job training program, the ability to connect into the community and find those individual stories of both hardship and triumph, to be able to share that back. I think that just went out.
Yep, it just went out. No.
This one? If I yell really loudly?
That's what women do.
Does this one work? We'll share?
I think they all went down.
Can you? No?
They're all on.
Hello? No, we don't have any. They're all out now.
Okay.
Just keep talking.
Okay, I'm going to try to, do you want to see if that one works?
Yeah, they're all out.
Is this one working?
No.
Okay. If we try to be really loud, we just have a few minutes left. Can everyone hear me?
Oh.
This is my outdoor playground voice. So we'll try to do that. Can everyone hear me now?
Yep, there you go. Okay. We got it.
Oh, and you're back on.
Yep. Yep, you are.
There we go. Okay, here we go. Pulling into the home stretch. So I think with that in mind, the connectivity between local, state, and federal, I'm wondering if each of you could touch briefly on an example that you might have locally that may or may not connect to, but just policy change that's happened. And when I say policy change, I loved how Anne talked about policy with a little p, because there's lots of opportunities to change policy that's not necessarily solely about enacting a particular piece of legislation, right? There's an opportunity to influence an employer, for example.
Absolutely.
So I just, if each of you could take a moment to just give an example of a policy in your community that you've been able to impact, frame, change. Elizabeth?
Sure, I talked about a little bit before. One of our grantees, Mother Women. I know we have some representatives from Mother Women in the crowd. They're one of our grantees, but they also are led by our LIPI graduates as well. They are primarily or kind of a direct service type of organization working with mothers who were recently or have had issues around post-pregnancy and being an advocate for them. But they'd never worked in the policy sphere. And actually, they've supported doing that sort of thing, but never led a piece of legislation. After attending LIPI and really being energized, and there was a good group of people who worked at Mother Woman who were now trained as advocates. They are now leading that bill, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which basically ensures that women don't have to choose between being pregnant and having a job. And that's on a verge of passage. We're very, very hopeful for its passage. But again, it's an opportunity where it's the very first time they were leading on a bill, but they were able to connect not only with the kind of regional leadership that's here, but they were also to connect nationally to organizations that have passed a similar type of bill across the country. Phone calls, coalition calls, things like that they aided in helping kind of even just the nuance of negotiating a bill into the verge of being passed is something that you have to learn by doing, but also is important to be able to connect them to that national network. So again, I think it's a great example of how it was locally led by women who understood the constituency very, very well. They weren't professional lobbyists or anything like that. But because of the ties to a regional and national network, we're able to get the best learnings and the best practices to be able to be very, very successful. And we're very hopeful for its passage.
I'm going to keep my fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Ruby, do you want to share?
Yes, I will. This again is probably more on the ground kind of successful work in terms of policy change, a policy curve maybe, it's a better way to state this. As you think back over the past 6 or 7 years, I don't know, time goes by much faster than I can count these days. But there was, I don't know if you all remember when there was the solar energy grants, federal grants that were, amassing, and there was opportunities. And so we saw that as an opportunity for women to get into higher paying jobs, right? And these funds came through the Workforce Investment Network. And for those of you who are practicing, you recognize that, there's employment, there's training dollars, for employment, there's, getting people to work, and workforce investment organizations really, they have mandates in various levels. My point being is that access to the training dollars to pay for the training required you stepping up to certain levels. What we found is that women starting to go in to enter at the workforce development, they were turned around at the door. They were asked like 1 or 2 questions. Do you have your GED? Or, and then they were turned around. Like, you couldn't get past go. And what's causing this? So we tried to find out, is this a state law? Is this a local law? Is this a local rule, state law, federal law? Could not find any answers to that. And finally, just calling and asking. And so finally, I decided to go to one of the Workforce Development Network's meetings, which, by the way, are open to the public, but people don't know that. So it's made up of people who are providing the services. And the rule was actually made up, was developed locally, so it could change. It was not state. And we, the Women's Foundation, advocated to Workforce Investment Network Board to change that, or at least bridge that, so that we could take advantage of these trainings to provide solar panels into low-income homes. So there was a market for the work, and we were able to. So they said no, they could not change it. The Women's Foundation, core leaders that are in the community, on the board of directors, and also have a long-standing relationship with many businesses who were looking for jobs. We ended up going to the city of Memphis, to the mayor, and informed him that he appointed that board, and that we felt like that they needed to make a change. And we were able to get that change overturned and got 22 women employed in that particular program. So that's something I'm very proud of.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ruby. Dawn, do you have an example?
Just really briefly, so when you say, you know, policy and a little p, that's probably exactly what the Iowa Women's Foundation has been. Really just a lot of education and informing. But after we traveled the state the last 2 summers, it's really become apparent to us that we have to change that little p to a large P, and that policy and advocacy are really going to be essential to our work moving forward. And we are in the middle of a strategic planning retreat trying to decide just what does that mean for us, because we want to be effective and we know we can't do it all right up front. So what part can we take, and you know, where can we be the most successful, then we'll be looked at and, you know, be able to grow it from there.
Thank you. And I think for us, one of the things in DC, we are known for passing fairly progressive, fantastic laws, but are not so good about implementation and enforcement. And so that is a component that we've added on to our work. So we have paid sick. Tip workers are not included, so that's the next big push locally. There's a paid family bill that's pending now that we're doing a lot of work on, but really not just stopping at that moment of once something has been passed, but really thinking about implementation and enforcement. And then the other thing in terms of sort of influencing and affecting change is, and we didn't actually talk a lot about this, but maybe because it was implied or assumed, which is applying a gender lens and a racial equity lens to the work that we do. And that's been an interesting conversation and moment for us, because some of the organizations, when we first started funding them, really had never stopped to think about what their women clients needed and how that might be different from the men that they were serving if they were serving men. And so one of my favorite examples is Goodwill of Greater Washington, which is a huge organization, multi-million-dollar budget, far larger than we are. And when we first started funding them, we funded them for a pilot project to do job training for a women in construction program. And it was the first time that they had ever worked with a female-only cohort. And they got about 6 months into it and came back to us and said, we had no idea the barriers that these women were facing. And the instructor, who had been hired to teach them the curriculum of the trades, was faced with actually being a case manager. And he had no idea where to refer women in terms of public benefits or transportation or childcare, mental health issues, and was overwhelmed. And so they came back to us and said, we need to hire a case manager to work with these women in order to reduce their barriers, ensure that they make it through the program, and then work through them through that employment process. And so that's something we supported for a number of years. And then they came back to us to say, we realize as an employer, we don't do for our employees what we're actually doing for the women in the job training program. And they made a fundamental shift as an organization to change their HR policies and hire case managers to work with their staff. And I feel like that's a win. That is a policy change. May not be a law, but it's a fantastic change. So I know we're at the end, but I want us to end on an incredibly hopeful and optimistic note. So we did $29 million in the first year. I think we're going to blow $100 million over 5 years out of the water. I think we're not ambitious enough. But I would love for each of you to close with maybe 2 or 3 words that are your hopes, dreams. What do you want for women and girls in the future? Elizabeth?
I'll actually end with one word.
Okay.
Everything.
Everything.
Okay.
Okay. Ruby, I'm not quite sure what you're going to do with that, but
Well, I want leadership. I want leadership empowerment. I want self-empowerment for women. I mean, let's all of us just take it on. Okay, that's probably 20 words. Okay.
Dawn?
Okay, so my 3 are hope, respect, and success.
Awesome. Thank you all
Thank you
three
all
for being
very
in
much.
partnership. And please join me in thanking our panelists.
So I wanted to thank Jennifer, Elizabeth, Ruby, and Dawn for being here today and sharing your fantastic work on prosperity together with us. And I'd like to give a special shout out to Elizabeth. She is a tireless worker on our planning committee and also a board member. And we really couldn't have pulled this off without her. So thank you so much.